All right, guys, lesson 1, part 4 here, and hopefully this will be the last part for lesson 1. This is one of the longest lessons of the term. Some of them are super, super, super short, like they'll be 20 minutes, the whole lesson. So just so you know. Before I start, though, I do want to show you, where was I? I want to show you our Canvas page, because this stuff that's posted, I want you guys to understand what all this stuff is. So first of all, so this is just like the home page when you walk or when you go in, and then if you click on files, that's kind of where I keep everything. I'm not too fancy. I just kind of keep everything in files. And so if you click on this, if you click on PowerPoints, there are all the PowerPoints for the entire semester. So this is all, lesson 1 is what we've been doing. So you'll have the PowerPoint. You can print that off if you want, download it, whatever. Save it to your computer. Let's see what else I wanted to show you in files. I also wanted to show you. So you've got the syllabus is in there, obviously, but here's the description for article review number 1. So remember, you've got a couple of reflection papers that are going to be due. One of them due on June 8th, another one due on June 12th, and then your first article review is due on June 17th. I explained all these assignments in the syllabus and kind of a little bit in that first lecture that I recorded, that course intro that I recorded and posted to the internet that you should have seen by now. If you have any other questions, let me know. I think it's all pretty straightforward, but if you have questions, just drop me an email if any of this is unclear. But this is the description for the article review. You can read that there. Some of the readings that you don't have access to, like the Baxter and Babby, that you noticed that in the syllabus, you're going to have to do an article review on that, so that's important to read. This is another reading, the Fornicari reading for later in the term. So those are all posted here. You've got a couple of examples of coding sheets in here. You don't know what those are yet necessarily, but you will. And those are just some examples for you to look at. This is a contribution sheet for the final project. So the final project is done in groups, as I've already said. And I don't think it's fair if like one person does all the work and somebody's like a deadbeat that just does nothing. So what I do is I have you guys evaluate one another. So you're not all going to necessarily get the same exact grade. I mean, all of your members of your group are not necessarily going to get the same exact grade. Somebody might get a 95 and somebody else in the same group might get a 70. I mean, just depending on how much work they did. So you guys need to evaluate one another, and I'll talk more about how you guys are going to do that later. This is a list of journals. So remember in I think it was in part 3 of lesson 1, I kind of went through that database with you guys and showed you guys how to identify scholarly peer-reviewed articles using that Communication and Mass Media Complete database. Well, in case you're interested in looking at like what are some journals in our field, because some of the stuff that's going to come up when you do searches in that database, some of the stuff that's going to come up is, I mean, there's some really obscure journals that I've even, frankly, never even heard of. So if you want to really be safe, I mean, these journals that I'm posting here, I'm just opening this up so you can, I don't know how well you can read this right now. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. But so like these are major journals in our field. If you find an article in this journal, for example, Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, it is scholar, unless it's a book review. I mean, they do publish book reviews, but if it's a study, if it's a research article, that is scholarly, peer reviewed, and it's good because that's a really good journal. Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media, Journal of Communication, Journalism Studies, Communication Theory. These are all Mass Communication Society is a major one. These are all really big name journals. Some of the ones in the end here, these are all really good journals as well, but they're just a little bit more obscure. These ones at the top here, like especially in the top 6 or top 9, top 10, these are like really top tier journals, like really outstanding journals. Okay, so And you can actually search by journal in that database if you wanted to do that. So I just wanted to alert you to that so you weren't confused when you saw that. And this is just a little guide. When we study textual analysis later in the term, this is just a little something for you to gain a little bit more knowledge about. Okay? It'll just kind of help you understand textual analysis a little bit better. So this is where we left off last time, talking about research questions. These are just some examples. You can read through these on your own, examples of good and bad research questions. If you have questions, let me know. I mean, this is one where, what marketing strategies does the Coca-Cola company currently apply? That seems pretty reasonable. Question B, this is really bad. What is the Coca-Cola company's future marketing plan? You can't tell the future, so that's not a good question. And this is a terrible question as well. Question C, what marketing strategies has the Coca-Cola company used in the past? That's a bad question because the past is super broad. Coca-Cola has been around for more than 100 years, so that's a really, really broad question. Hypotheses statements have the same principles basically as research questions. Don't make them too narrow. Don't make them too broad. Sometimes you can just think of a research question and then reword it into a hypothesis. So for example, does the TV show, you might be wondering, does the television show Oprah, when it was still on the air, I thought of this example a while back when Oprah was still on the air, does the TV show Oprah increase self-esteem amongst Qatari teenage girls? It's an interesting question, perhaps. You could rephrase that as a hypothesis. If I have some reason, based on the theory or based on the literature, something else, if I have some reason to believe that I should word this as a hypothesis, I have some kind of confidence where I could express this as an educated guess, then I could reword it like this. The television show Oprah will increase self-esteem amongst Qatari teenage girls. So, hypotheses, statements. Here's an example of, I'm just going to take you through an example of a study that I did. Okay, just so you can see how this works. This is an actual study that I did and that I published. I had one. This was a study where I just had one research question. Okay, I asked one research question. Now it's a pretty complex question, so pay attention. How does Egyptian newspaper content reflect constraints on news work at institutional, organizational, and individual levels, and do content patterns vary across the major newspaper ownership categories? There's a lot going on there, admittedly. So let me try to break it down. So I wanted to know whether or not journalists, the people that do the news work at Egyptian newspapers, I wanted to know if they were constrained by institutional, organizational, and individual level constraints. Institutional level, like individual level constraints are like individual levels of training and knowledge, stuff like that. Organizational constraints are like editorial policy, ownership of the particular newspaper. They can constrain you sometimes as a journalist. And then institutional level constraints are like national constraints, like things that affect the entire country and the entire news system, like the ideology of the nation, the government's policies, the culture, stuff like that. So I wanted to know, did these different levels of constraints actually work to kind of exert themselves on journalists at Egyptian newspapers? And the second part of the question says, it asks about the newspaper ownership categories. I wanted to find out if the constraints would be different at government newspapers and independent newspapers, and also opposition newspapers. Because in Egypt, like in the United States, we just have independent newspapers. But in Egypt, they have government-owned newspapers, opposition party-owned newspapers, and then you have the independent, privately owned newspapers as well. So what did I do? How did I do it? So first of all, ask yourself a question. What method do you think I chose carry out in this particular case? Think about that for a second. What method? Remember I said, I'll give you a hint. It's a quantitative method. So we talked about 3 quantitative methods, primary methods that we use in our field. Remember what those are? Remember, content analysis, survey, experiment. So what do you think I did here? I'm interested in content here. How does the Egyptian newspaper content reflect these constraints? Well, since I want to study content, I did a content analysis. So, first thing I had to do was I had to select which newspapers I wanted to study. Remember, I want to study an independent newspaper, an opposition newspaper, and a government newspaper. So I could select a bunch of them. I just selected 1 newspaper in each category. So I had a total of 3 newspapers. Then, and I have to, it's got to be apples to apples. So I picked the largest newspaper in each category, okay? Then, you can't study every single article that they've ever published, so you have to decide on a time period, and then you have to randomly select articles. That's very, very important. Random sampling is crucial. You can't just pick articles willy-nilly, just like, oh, I'll just pick this one, I'll pick this one. Because then what you could do is, you could just pick the ones that are going to help you find what you want to find, right? You don't want to do that. As a scientist, you want to be objective. So you do a random sample. And the beautiful thing about the random sample is that it's representative. So this is a good stopping point. If you wanted to do a survey of Americans to find out what Americans think about the president, for example, and they do this all the time, right? Like the approval rating of the president. Do you think you'd have to go and ask every single American? There are like 330 million Americans. That would be pretty tough to do. That'd be impossible, frankly. So what do? You take a random sample. Now, if you just take a sample, not a random sample, if you just take a sample, that would be a disaster. Let's just say you just say, oh, I'm going to go and ask a few people on the street in Florence, Alabama. What do you think about the president? Do you think those few people on the street, even if you asked 10,000 people in Florence, even if you asked everybody in Florence, Alabama, do you think that sample is representative of Americans? No, of course not. Because those are people in just one small city in the United States, about 100,000 people or whatever the population of Florence, Alabama is, right? So there are 330 million Americans. That's not a representative sample, okay? You have a problem. You can't do that. That would be really easy and convenient. You're just in one location. But you also can't ask everybody. You can't ask 330 million Americans. So what should you do? You should take a random sample. That means literally what you're doing is it's almost like you're putting all these names in a hat and you're just drawing out the names randomly. And here's what we know about random samples. And this is the beautiful part. Random samples represent the populations from which they're drawn. Let me say that again. Random samples they are representative of the populations from which they're drawn. In other words, if you took a really good random sample of Americans, like typically in these polls they'll do like 5,000 people or something like that. If you take a random sample of 5,000 people, just 5,000 people out of 330 million, if it's a good random sample, it will be representative of all Americans. In other words, even if you were to then go out and ask all Americans, you'd still end up with the same result. It wouldn't be exactly the same result, but it'd be very close. So for example, if you do your random sample of 5,000 or 4,000 Americans or whatever, let's say you come up with 40% of Americans are pleased with the job that the president is doing. I'm just making that up, right? I think President Obama's approval rating is like 49% or something like that, which is pretty respectable. But so let's say you come up with, you do your random sample and you get 40% as an approval rating. What that's telling you is that even if you were to go out and ask everybody You just dedicated like all this money and resources and time to going out and asking every single American what he or she thinks of the job that President Obama is doing, you'd get what? The same result. You'd get 40%. Because the random sample is just as good as asking everybody. When we ask everybody, it's called a census. We take a census. A random sample is just as good as a census. And it's beautiful because it's so much easier. It's 5,000 asking 5,000 people or 4,000 people is a heck of a lot easier than asking 330 million people, right? Now I'm exaggerating slightly because the numbers are going to be a little bit off. There's always a little bit of a margin of error when we sample, and we're going to talk about that later in the semester. But I'm exaggerating right now just to kind of prove a point that random sampling is really good, and you can get really, really close to the real value, right? So anyways, I took a random sampling of newspaper articles. In this case, I wasn't doing a survey. The content that I'm working with is newspaper articles, and so my population was all of the newspaper articles that had been published by these newspapers during the time period that I selected, which was 2008. So what did I do? I can't read every single article published by all of these newspapers, so I selected some articles randomly, okay? And the beautiful thing again is that those articles are representative of what the newspapers were publishing at that time. Then, here's the great thing about content analysis. I didn't even read the articles. All I did was I came up with some questions and I wrote them down on a piece of paper that we call a coding sheet, okay? So I wrote down my coding sheet, right? Came up with my coding sheet. And actually, you can see it on the Canvas site. You can see the questions that I came up with. And what I did is I gave the coding sheet and I gave all the articles to 2 coders. 2 other people besides myself, 2 people that read the articles and coded them. They answered all the questions on these articles, right? They went through every single article and answered every single question that I had in my coding sheet, right, for all of the articles. And they do that independent of one another, right? So let's say I have 200 articles, one coder reads 100 and the other coder reads 100, and they answer all the questions and they send me the results, okay? Now, you might say, well, why do I do that? It's better if I did it myself, then you could say, well, he's biased, or he may have just answered the questions that we don't know. How can we be sure that the way he answered these questions is the same way that I'd answer the questions, right? So what we do to, remember, we want to be objective, is we have someone here. I'm saying I'll let somebody else read the articles. I came up with the questions, yeah, but somebody else is going to read the articles. And it's not just going to be one person. It's going to be 2 different people. And here's the great part about it, is I make sure I do these tests called intercoder reliability tests. I make sure that the 2 people are answering the questions in exactly the same way. And I'll show you how to do that later in the semester. But so when we do a content analysis, it's like really scientific. You randomly select articles, you come up with just a list of questions, you're going to ask the same questions, you're going to go through the same coding sheet for every single article in your sample. And 200 articles or 300 articles, you're going to ask the same questions of every single article, and you're not even going to read them. It's going to be 2 other people, and you're going to, in this really kind of covert way, you're going to test to make sure that they are answering the questions in exactly the same way. So what that's saying to somebody else who's reading my study, after I've done the study and I've published it and people are reading it, they should be pretty convinced that if I read these articles, I'd probably find the same thing. Because, heck, this guy didn't even read them. It was 2 other people, and they came up with the exact same results. They agreed, right? So it's a very scientific process, right? So that's what I did. I trained my coders. They answered the questions. I got the data. I analyzed the data. I wrote my paper. I published it. That's how I did it. We'll talk more about content analysis later in the term. Some definitions. We've already went over some of these. Theory is a theory is something which explains natural phenomena. It's one of the goals of science. Remember, It helps. It's a statement of prediction in many cases. It helps us to predict things. Measurement is a very important concept. This is when we assign numbers to objects or events or concepts according to rules. So it's a set of rules for assigning numbers, which represent values of varying degrees of precision. Now, remember what I said. In the social sciences, we're not working with physical properties like, chemicals and stuff like that. We are dealing with concepts most of the time. So we're going to measure things like level of aggression. How do you measure that? We're going to measure things like news bias. How do you measure that? Well, you have to assign numbers to concepts, right? According to certain rules. So for example, let me think of an example here. Let's say we wanted to do a study on religiosity. Let's say we wanted to find out, there's a journal in our field called the Journal of Media and Religion. So let's say we wanted to measure religiosity, how religious people are. It's hard to do. It's not like measuring somebody's weight. I mean, measuring somebody's weight is easy. Here, go stand on the scale and you measure it. Okay, you're 150 pounds. Great. That's easy. Measuring concepts, that's more difficult. Measurement in social science is very hard. So here's what we'd have to do to measure religiosity. We'd have to come up with a very specific set of rules, right? Where certain numbers stand in for certain things, right? So we might come up with a scale of questions, like to what extent do you think to what extent is religion important in your life? We're gonna have basically a series of questions, and we're gonna give these to people, and they're gonna answer the questions. And when they answer the questions, we're gonna be able to say, this person's very religious. This person's relatively religious. This person's not religious at all. So we're measuring religion, but we're doing it. It's gonna be numbers. Like every person's gonna have a score. So the first question in our little religiosity scale might be, to what extent is religion important to you? And it'd be 1 to 5, right? 5 is very important. A 1 is not important at all, right? And then in between. Second question, how strong is your faith in God? A 5 is very strong. And then a 1 would be not very weak, a very little faith in God. Another question might be, how often do you pray? Very often. Not often at all. Never, right? Never pray. So anyways, we have all these questions, and then people are going to get okay, 5, 4, 3, 1, 5, 1, 5, 3. Everyone's going to get these numbers. And at the end, people are going to basically have religiosity scores. So we've measured religiosity. Oh, this person's a 4.6. They're really religious. This person's a 3.4. Fairly religious, relatively religious. This person's a 1.1. Not religious at all, right? So that's what we mean by measurement. We do this in our quantitative studies, in our field in mass communication, and we'll work with this more later. A couple of other definitions here: internal validity, external validity. Internal validity is concerned with whether the measurement is an accurate representation of the concept being studied. So internal validity is concerned with, are we measuring what we think we are measuring? Let me ask that again, because this is the question that you want to ask about internal validity. Are we measuring what we think we are measuring? Okay? So for instance, if I said, go out and tell me how many people in Alabama use the internet, and you came back and said, oh, I went and I called Comcast and Charter and whoever else the companies are, and I got all the internet access data. And this is how many Alabamians have access to the internet. And you come back at a number. And you know what I would say to you? I would say, the job that you have done is internally invalid, that you do not have any internal validity, because all you've done is you've measured access to the internet. You have not measured use of the internet. I asked you to measure use of the internet. I asked you to tell me how many Alabamians use the internet. But many people in Alabama have access to the internet, but they don't use it. Like one household might have an internet service at their home, 5 people, but maybe 2 people in the house don't even use the internet at all. They never use it. So access is not the same as use. That's just an example. But in internal validity, we want to eliminate confounding variables. And if you can eliminate confounding variables, you're going to have a high level of internal validity. Now, at this point, you don't know what a confounding variable is, but I will explain that later. Okay? So just kind of hold that thought. External validity is concerned with whether the results of a research study are generalizable to the population. The example that I just gave with random sampling, remember the example I just gave with, like, if we wanted to find out what President Obama's approval rating is, if you just went around to people in Florence, Alabama and asked them, that is not generalizable to the American population, because people in Florence, Alabama are not representative. People in any one city are not representative. To get a representative sample, to be able to generalize, right, you have to take a random sample, as we said. If you do that, if you take a random sample, and now you can represent the population, now you can say, you can generalize, and you say, I have a high level of external validity. So external validity is concerned with generalizability, and internal validity is concerned with whether or not we are measuring what we say we're measuring. And how do we do a random sample? It's kind of just, you take numbers out of, you assign numbers to the objects that you're drawing and just pull them out of a hat. So if you want to do a random sample of people in Alabama, put all 5 million Alabamians in a hat, like, ID numbers, and just draw them out. That's how you would do it. And basically the official definition is where every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So when I did my study in Egypt with all those newspaper articles, there were thousands of newspaper articles. I basically did that. I kind of put all the articles in a hat and I drew articles out. And I didn't actually literally do it that way. I had a random number generator, so I did it by computer, but that's kind of what we did, or what I did. So those are a few definitions. We'll revisit a lot of these over the course of the term, but make sure that you read up on these. You can do a little bit of independent reading. Look at the definitions in the book, because these are important definitions. You should understand what these things are. I just want to go through this really quickly, because soon you're going to start reading some research papers. So I want you to know what to expect. Whenever you read a research paper, you're going to get the first thing you're going to see is a title. Then you're going to see an abstract. Usually, not all the time, but usually you'll see an abstract. It's just a short summary of the research, usually 100 words or so, sometimes 75 words, 150, sometimes 200, but it's a short summary. Then you get an introduction. There's always an introduction in any paper that you're going to read. In the introduction, you'll find basically a statement of the problem. You'll find a purpose statement. Sometimes it'll say, like, it'll be really explicit. It'll be like, the purpose of this study is to do whatever, to test whatever. And then they'll also, in the introduction, answer the so what question. That's kind of the explanation of why this study is important. Like, why should anyone care? Then after the introduction, remember we talked about the literature review. There's where they're going to review what other researchers have done in this area. That's what comes next. So you get the title, the abstract, the introduction, the literature review. Then we get the theoretical framework. We're going to say, this study is grounded in such and such theory, whatever, agenda setting theory, or the third person effect theory, or cultivation theory, or whatever theory. And then you explain the theory, and you explain how it applies to this study, and how this study is informed by this particular theory, right? You present your hypotheses. At the end of the theoretical framework section, typically, that's how it works. You present your theoretical framework, and then at the end, you've got your hypotheses or your research questions. Then you get your methodology. That's where you explain the research design. Tell everybody exactly what you did, such that if somebody wants to replicate your study, they could. They could just do exactly what you did, right? And then you present your results. And then, you present all the evidence, and then you present something called the discussion, which is basically kind of you reflect on some of the key findings, you discuss some of the limitations of the research, you address future research, you talk about what scholars should do in the future. The discussion is a very important section. Sometimes that's the last section in a paper, and then sometimes there'll be a conclusion section as well, where they'll just kind of summarize the findings, the key findings. And then you've got your references. That's basically it. If there's anything in this lesson, this is basically it for lesson 1. If there's anything in this lesson that you don't understand, that was unclear, drop me an email. We can get together in my virtual office hours on Skype and we can talk about it. But before you do that, make sure you do the readings. Read chapter 1 and chapter 2, because I think if you do that along with listening to these lessons, you'll understand what's being said. But again, if something's unclear, I'll be happy to explain it. And what else was I gonna say? Oh, a lot of this stuff, I would say at least half of this stuff is gonna end up being repeated several times. I mean, we're gonna be talking about hypotheses a lot. We'll be talking about measurement a lot. So if something's unclear, don't worry. You'll have other opportunities to